A father thought he had lost his little girl years ago, but 3 years later, he found her, and Annie, standing in front of his cabin on the snow-covered Nebraska plains. Seeing them again didn't just touch his heart, it shattered his past and forced him to face everything he'd tried to bury. Share where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to subscribe. Now, get ready to dive into Henry and Annie's unforgettable journey. The sun had barely crested the jagged horizon when I first noticed her. A small figure slumped against the roadside fence, half hidden by the morning mist that clung stubbornly to the Nebraska plains. I had been riding the same route for nearly 2 decades, alone and silent, every day blending into the last, every face in town a stranger. But that morning, as I nudged my horse closer, the sight of her, a girl, no older than 8, shivering in tattered clothes and dirt-streaked skin, stirred something long dormant in me. I had buried a daughter once, long ago, and though I would not let myself speak her name aloud, her memory haunted me. Lucy. Her laughter, bright and fleeting, was a ghost that had chased me from town to town, until I found myself here, on this lonely plot of land I had claimed as my own. Willow Creek. That small homestead, scarred by years of wind and sun, was my fortress against the world. Until now. The girl looked up as my shadow fell across the fence, and I saw in her eyes a mixture of terror and hope, like a bird trapped against the walls of a barn, desperate for escape but too weary to fly. I dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her further, and she flinched back, clutching a small bundle to her chest as though it were her only remaining anchor. I studied her from a distance, noting the bruises on her wrists, the scrape across her cheek, the way her small shoulders huddled against the chill. She had been abandoned, left to fend for herself along a road that had become as merciless as the sun overhead. For 3 years, I had lived in silence, speaking only when necessary, my hands calloused from labor and my heart sealed shut by grief. I had chosen isolation deliberately, believing it the only way to survive a world that had taken everything from me. And yet, as I watched her, a pang of recognition struck deep in my chest. The same wide-eyed fear I had once seen in my daughter now stared back at me from this stranger. I approached cautiously, my voice low and deliberate. "Are you alone?" No response came, only a shaky whimper and a small shake of the head. That was all I needed to know. She had been left behind, forgotten, cast off by someone who should have protected her. My grip tightened on the reins, my knuckles whitening as the wind whistled across the barren landscape, carrying the faint scent of pine from the distant hills. I could not leave her there. I had promised myself long ago that no child would ever suffer under my watch again, not while I still drew breath. Carefully, I lifted the bundle from her trembling hands, discovering a small collection of belongings, a doll missing an arm, a faded scarf, a tin cup dented from countless falls. She reached out instinctively, clutching my coat, seeking warmth and safety. I did not pull away. The journey back to my homestead was quiet, the only sound the labored breathing of the girl and the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the dirt road. I noticed every detail, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way her eyes darted toward every shadow, the tight coil of tension in her small frame. She had been trained to fear, and I understood all too well the weight of that kind of terror. By the time we reached Willow Creek, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the mist and illuminating the worn boards of the homestead. The house, humble and battered by years of storms, seemed to sag under the weight of its own solitude. Yet inside, it held warmth and the faint promise of something more, a second chance, fragile and trembling, much like the girl I had brought home. I led her inside, setting her down gently on the rough-hewn floorboards. She hesitated, glancing at the tools and furniture with wide eyes, unsure whether she had been delivered to safety or another trap. I said nothing, merely fetched a blanket and draped it over her small shoulders, feeling the stiff tremor of her body relax slightly under the heat. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to speak, my voice rough and foreign in its own home. "You're safe here. Nobody will hurt you." She did not respond, but I could see the faint glimmer of trust beginning to form, delicate and fragile, in her dark eyes. That evening, I cooked a simple meal, stewed rabbit and hard bread, and watched her eat with the same careful efficiency as a creature who had known hunger too intimately. Night fell, and the wind rose, rattling the shutters and sending the trees in the distance swaying like skeletal arms. She curled into the blanket I had provided, and though she did not speak, I sensed her small body beginning to let go of the constant vigilance that had carried her through so many days alone. And I, for the first time in 3 years, felt the stirrings of something I had not allowed myself to acknowledge. Hope. Not the shallow hope of the world beyond, but a quiet, enduring hope that perhaps, together, we could rebuild what had been lost. A home. A family. Something that no storm, no cruel hand, no past mistake could take away. As I watched her drift into a fitful sleep, my mind drifted to memories I had long tried to bury, memories of Lucy, of laughter cut short, of promises broken by fate and fire. And yet, in that dim, candlelit room, a sense of determination settled over me. I would not fail this child. I would protect her, teach her, and maybe, in the process, redeem myself. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the chill of approaching winter. But inside, the small homestead held a fragile warmth, and for the first time in years, I felt something like peace. I did not yet know what the coming days would bring, whether her past would find us, whether danger would come riding across the plains. But I knew one thing. I had chosen her, and she had chosen to follow me. And that choice, fleeting and fragile as it might be, was the beginning of everything. The following weeks unfolded slowly, almost painfully, like the first tentative shoots of grass breaking through frozen soil. Annie, as she had introduced herself, moved through the homestead with the careful caution of someone who had learned the hard way that the world could turn cruel in a heartbeat. At first, she did not speak much. She ate in silence, watched silently, and moved about as though she feared disturbing the air itself. I had given her a corner of the living room, a cot with a thin mattress that I had once used for myself before the grief drove me to sleep in the barn. On the first night, she had clutched the blanket to her chin so tightly I thought she might strangle herself. I said nothing. Instead, I poured water into a tin cup, placed it near her cot, and left her to her unease. Over the days, she began to stretch her limbs, walk through the kitchen, peek into the pantry, even linger near the fireplace without curling in fear. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to belong here. Winter was approaching, and with it came a biting wind that sliced across the plains. Every morning I would feed the animals before the frost had melted from the ground, and every evening, Annie followed me, her small boots crunching on the frozen earth. She had begun to imitate my movements, helping where she could, carrying tools and bundles of hay, though often awkwardly. I noticed the way she studied me, her eyes tracking every motion, as if memorizing not just the chores, but the rhythm of life itself. One morning, I caught her attempting to milk the old cow, the same cow I had stubbornly argued with for years until I could coax her into compliance. Annie's small hands fumbled, and the bucket tipped more than once. Milk spilled onto the floor, soaking her threadbare sleeves. She froze, expecting scolding or anger, but I only watched, suppressing the reflex to correct her. When she finally glanced up, her eyes wide with terror, I offered a small nod. "Try again," I said, my voice rough but steady. "It's all right. You'll get it." She blinked, uncomprehending at first, then slowly bent back over the cow, hands trembling yet determined. I could feel a swell of pride I had not allowed myself in years. Watching her, I remembered Lucy, remembered the pride that used to blossom in her eyes whenever she accomplished even the smallest task. And though the memory brought a sharp ache, it also ignited a purpose in me. I would not fail this girl. I could not. Evenings were spent by the fire. I would sit in the worn rocking chair, repairing tools, whittling scraps of wood, while Annie attempted to mimic me with her own small projects, shaping twigs into crude dolls, tracing letters in the soot of the fireplace, or fashioning simple shapes from clay. Her concentration was intense, almost obsessive, and I noticed how her gaze softened when she realized she had my approval. Yet, beneath the small routines of our days, there was a tension that never quite left. Annie flinched at sudden noises. Shadows made her retreat to the far corners of the room, and the mere creak of the barn door in the wind sent her small frame into spasms of fear. One afternoon, I caught her hiding beneath the table after a gust had rattled the shutters. Kneeling beside her, I placed a rough hand on her shoulder, careful to avoid any sudden movement. "Nothing is going to get you here," I said quietly. "I'm right here. Do you understand?" She nodded, still trembling, and slowly allowed me to lift her from her hiding place. It was a delicate dance, this rebuilding of trust, one I performed every day with painstaking care. I had learned long ago that fear like hers was not overcome in a single moment. It required patience, constancy, and an unshakable presence. The homestead itself seemed to shift with her presence. Where once the silence had been oppressive, the walls now echoed faintly with laughter or murmurs. She began to ask questions, hesitant at first, about everything: the animals, the weather, the stars. Her curiosity was insatiable, a bright flame that illuminated corners of the homestead long buried in shadow. I answered sparingly, allowing her to draw her own conclusions, to learn through observation. Slowly, she began to participate in meals, feeding the chickens, stacking firewood, even attempting to bake biscuits under my careful guidance. It was during one of these quiet evenings, the fire crackling and the wind screaming outside, that I noticed her looking at me with a weight in her eyes I had not seen before. It was the kind of look that made me catch my breath, a mixture of fear, longing, and hope. I knew then that the danger was not yet over. Her past had left marks too deep to ignore, and sooner or later, it would follow her here. Days turned into weeks, and the first heavy snows began to fall. The plains were blanketed in white, and the cold seeped into every crack and corner of the homestead. I worked tirelessly, shoring up the roof, repairing shutters, reinforcing fences, all while keeping one eye on Annie, ensuring she did not wander too far or fall victim to the treacherous winter conditions. It was on a night when the storm raged fiercest that I first heard the sound that would haunt me, the distant crunch of boots in snow, uneven and deliberate, coming from the direction of the road. My heart tightened instantly. I knew that gait. I had spent years listening for it, training myself to recognize the approach of men who would bring harm, and there was no mistaking the intent in those steps. Annie slept lightly, and I could hear her stirring even from the far side of the room. I moved quietly to the door, my hands gripping the rifle that had hung untouched for months. The snow beat against the windows, swirling in chaotic patterns, masking shapes and forms, yet there was no doubt in my mind, someone had come for her. The weeks that followed were a test of endurance, patience, and courage. I taught Annie to recognize danger, to trust her instincts, and to find small ways to defend herself. And I, in turn, confronted memories I had long tried to bury. The helplessness, the guilt, the mistakes that had cost me Lucy. Each day, each chore, each shared meal was an act of redemption, a small claim against the shadows of the past. By the time the winter storm broke, a fragile bond had been forged. Annie laughed, albeit quietly, as she stumbled across the frozen yard, chasing the chickens or helping me repair broken fence rails. She had begun to smile without fear in her eyes, her trust in me no longer tentative but growing steadily with every shared task, every gentle word, every careful gesture of protection. Yet, even as the warmth of this tentative family began to take hold, I knew that the peace we had found was temporary. The world beyond our homestead was harsh, and the man who had abandoned her would not forget, would not relent. And when he came, as he surely would, the lessons we had learned, the trust we had built, and the bond we shared would be tested beyond anything either of us had known. For now, though, we had today. We had the small victories of trust, the warmth of the fire, and the quiet understanding that in the vast emptiness of the Nebraska plains, two broken souls had found each other and begun to heal. And for the first time in years, I dared to imagine a future where we could survive, not just as individuals but together. The days following the first warning were tense. Every gust of wind, every shadow stretching across the snow-laden homestead seemed to carry menace. Annie moved cautiously now, no longer with the tentative curiosity of a child learning her place, but with the acute awareness of someone who knew danger could appear at any moment. She watched the road constantly, her small hands clenched into fists, lips pressed into a thin, determined line. I tried to keep the routine as normal as possible, but even I felt the weight pressing in from the outside world. I doubled the watch over the barn, reinforced the shutters, and prepared the rifle at night within arm's reach. Annie was observant, and she noticed everything, her eyes sharp, her ears attuned to the slightest sound. One afternoon, while stacking firewood, I saw her flinch at a distant movement across the plains. A figure, hunched against the wind, trudging slowly through the drifts of snow. My heart tightened. I knew him before I even saw his face clearly. The man who had abandoned her, whose shadow had haunted her past, whose intent had finally found our isolated homestead. I didn't speak immediately, instead guiding Annie back into the barn, showing her the safest corners, the hidden spaces, and the methods to remain silent. Her small body trembled against mine as I whispered instructions, her trust complete despite the fear that trembled in her eyes. "Remember," I said quietly, "if he comes too close, you hide here. Do not come out until I signal. Understand?" She nodded, her lips pressed together, and clutched the edge of the hayloft ladder. The man's arrival was subtle at first, a shadow at the fence line, a boot print pressed into the snow. But as he neared, his voice broke the silence, low and grating, calling her name with cruel familiarity. Annie's breath hitched, and I felt the instinctive urge to strike, to defend, to protect. I stepped into the open, rifle raised. The wind bit at my face, but I did not flinch. The figure froze as our eyes met, a silent confrontation stretching into eternity, each of us measuring the other. The snow swirled around us, hiding details, but nothing masked intent. I saw the malice, the recklessness, and the certainty that he believed he could take what he wanted without consequence. "Stay back," I warned, my voice calm but firm. "She doesn't belong to you." For a moment, he laughed, a sound as harsh as cracking ice. "She's mine," he spat. "And you have no say." I tightened my grip on the rifle, feeling the cold metal against my palms, the weight both comforting and heavy with responsibility. "You're wrong. She belongs here, with someone who cares for her. And if you try—" "Try what?" he interrupted, stepping closer. His movements were deliberate, calculated. Danger radiated from every motion, every glance. Before I could answer, Annie moved. She darted out from her hiding place, small and swift, but unarmed, fearless in her desperation. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, the sound slicing through the wind like a blade. The man staggered, momentarily taken aback by the fire in her voice. And in that instant, everything shifted. I realized that this confrontation was no longer about passive observation or quiet protection. It had become an all-out struggle for survival, for trust, for the fragile bond we had nurtured over weeks of isolation and care. I fired a warning shot, the loud crack echoing across the plains, and the man faltered, cursing. Annie took the moment to retreat further into the barn, and I followed closely, rifle raised, every sense heightened. The storm outside raged, and the howling wind became an ally, masking movements, creating opportunities, and adding to the tension that gripped every nerve. Inside the barn, we barricaded the doors with whatever we could find: barrels, planks, tools. Annie watched me silently, eyes wide, but without crying. She understood that fear was useless now. Action and trust were all that mattered. Together, we worked in tense coordination, a silent pact forming in the midst of chaos. Outside, I could hear him pacing, attempting to find a way in, testing our resolve. But each effort was met with preparation, with strategy, with determination born from weeks of surviving the plains together. I realized then that the girl beside me, once fragile and tentative, had become a partner in defense, her courage matching the trust one had placed in her. The night stretched on, long and grueling, each moment teetering on the edge of disaster. Snow fell, wind screamed, and shadows danced across the walls of the barn, but the bond forged in shared vigilance held strong. And by the time the first hints of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the intruder had retreated, leaving behind footprints in the snow and the knowledge that the homestead was defended, not just by me, but by two unlikely allies bound by trust, fear, and the growing realization that survival required unity. Exhausted, we sat together on the cold floor, huddled beneath blankets, listening to the last whispers of the storm. Annie leaned against me, small and shivering, but unbroken. I felt the same, a mix of relief and pride tempered with the lingering awareness that this confrontation was only the beginning. The past would always come seeking its due, and the future would demand every ounce of courage we could summon. But for now, we had endured. And in the silence of the storm's passing, I finally allowed myself to hope. Not just for survival, but for the life we were beginning to build together against all odds. The days after the storm were eerily calm. The snow had buried the landscape under a thick, sparkling blanket, transforming the harsh, unforgiving frontier into something almost serene. But beneath the peaceful exterior, the tension remained, taut and unyielding. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind through the barn felt magnified, like the world itself was conspiring to remind us that danger was never far away. Annie moved with more confidence now, but her eyes betrayed the memory of that night. She followed me around the homestead, mimicking my movements, learning the patterns, absorbing every precaution I took. I had begun to see her not just as a child to protect, but as a resilient presence, capable of understanding the delicate balance between caution and courage. I tried to teach her simple tasks around the farm, chores that kept her occupied and gave her a sense of purpose. She learned quickly, her small hands surprisingly dexterous with the tools and implements I showed her. I watched her, a mix of pride and lingering sorrow settling in my chest. I thought of Lucy, the little girl I had lost so many years ago, and I saw fragments of her reflected in Annie. The cautious determination, the careful watchfulness, the quiet bravery. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, painting the snow in shades of orange and gold, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. I told her stories, not just the light-hearted tales she enjoyed, but stories of loss, of mistakes, of regrets that weighed on my shoulders. Annie listened with an intensity that made my heart ache. She didn't interrupt or judge. She simply absorbed, her presence a balm to the wounds I had carried in silence for too long. It was in these quiet moments, the shared warmth of the fire and the scent of cooking stew, that I began to feel the fragile threads of a family forming. We were not bound by blood, but by choice, by care, by the unspoken understanding that we had found something rare in the emptiness of the frontier, each other. But peace, as I had learned long ago, was never permanent. One late afternoon, as the shadows grew long across the snow, I spotted movement at the edge of the property. A figure trudged deliberately through the drifts, and my stomach tightened instantly. The man had returned, Annie's father, his silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. I signaled Annie to stay inside and moved to the porch, rifle in hand. The wind carried his words faintly, his voice as harsh and deliberate as ever. He had come prepared, and I could see it in the way he carried himself, in the set of his shoulders, in the deliberate cruelty in his step. I felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce resolve that drowned out the fear gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. This time, I would not be caught off guard. I had learned from the first encounter, and Annie had grown stronger too. Together, we were no longer just surviving. We were ready to fight for the life we were carving out together. The confrontation was inevitable. The man reached the gate, and I stepped forward, blocking his path. I could see recognition flash across his face, followed by a sneer. He underestimated us both. He always had. I held the rifle steady, my breath rising in puffs of white, each exhale a declaration of intent. He advanced, and I fired another warning shot, not to wound, but to assert the line that could not be crossed. Annie appeared beside me, unarmed, but with a presence that was almost startling in its courage. She didn't speak, she simply stood, a silent declaration that she was no longer the frightened child he had once abandoned. The wind howled, snow swirled around us, and the silence stretched tight between the three of us. And in that frozen moment, I realized that this confrontation was more than just a battle over possession. It was a test of the bond we had formed, of the family we were choosing to be. Hours passed in tense standoff, the bitter cold seeping into our bones, until finally, the man retreated, cursing and spitting threats into the wind. He had learned, at least for now, that taking what was ours would not be simple, that the child he had tried to control had found safety and courage, and that I would not allow the past to repeat itself. That night, as the fire crackled and Annie curled against my side, I felt a shift within myself. The grief that had haunted me for years, the guilt that had made me a hermit, began to lose its grip. In Annie's trust, in her resilience, I found a measure of redemption. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps we could build a future, not free from loss, but tempered by the strength we had forged together. The storm had passed, yet its lessons remained. Fear was no longer an enemy to hide from, but a reminder of what was worth protecting. And as I watched Annie drift into a quiet, exhausted sleep, I vowed that no shadow from the past would take her from this home, from this life we were creating. We had found each other, and nothing, not the harsh winds, not the bitter cold, not the cruel world beyond, would break what we were building. Winter deepened, the plains buried under an unbroken sheet of white. The cold was relentless, biting through layers of clothing and sapping energy, yet it did little to chill the determination in our hearts. Each morning, I awoke before sunrise, boots crunching through frozen snow as I checked on the animals and inspected the fences for breaks or weaknesses. Annie was already awake, waiting with a quiet patience that always surprised me. Her resilience was remarkable, and though she still bore the invisible scars of her past, her courage shone in small gestures. A steady hand feeding the chickens, a careful sweep of the porch, a careful, knowing glance when I worked with dangerous tools. The days began to blur together, the repetitive rhythm of survival creating a fragile peace. Yet that peace was deceptive. News of missing children traveled fast along the frontier, and rumors had begun to reach the ears of the wrong people. People who would see Annie not as a child but as a possession, a tool, or a bargaining chip. And I knew, deep down, that her father's shadow had not truly disappeared. He would return, and next time, he would come prepared. One evening, as the sky burned pink and gold in the brief twilight, I noticed footprints in the snow. Not from me or Annie, not from our animals, but small, deliberate impressions that led to the cabin. My heart thudded with a mixture of fear and anger. Someone had been here. I didn't need to guess long who it might be. The wind carried a faint scent of tobacco and unwashed wool, a combination all too familiar. I moved silently to the door, glancing toward the barn where Annie busied herself with feeding the horses. I signaled for her to stay inside, and she obeyed, retreating to the warmth of the kitchen with a hesitant look that I returned with a comforting nod. She had begun to trust me, but I could see the flicker of fear behind her eyes, a fear that I could not fully erase. Hours passed without further incident, and I began to convince myself that perhaps the footprints were nothing, that the cold wind and drifting snow had created illusions. But the frontier does not forgive carelessness. As darkness fell and the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, the unmistakable sound of a horse approaching cut through the night. The animal's hooves crunched over the ice-hardened snow, deliberate, heavy, and steady. My blood ran cold. He had returned. I quickly moved Annie to the small storage room behind the kitchen, barricading the door with an old trunk and whispering reassurances that I prayed she could believe. My hands trembled as I loaded my rifle, checking the chamber and sights with methodical precision. Years of survival in this unforgiving land had honed instincts that now screamed at me to protect, to fight, to do whatever it took to keep her safe. The first knock on the door was deliberate, slow, and taunting. "Henry," a voice called, low and threatening. I didn't respond. Another knock, sharper this time, accompanied by a faint, mocking laugh. The voice belonged unmistakably to him, Annie's father. He had returned with the same arrogance, the same cruel confidence that comes from knowing one believes they hold all the power. I set the rifle across my lap, listening to the wind carry the faint scrape of boots in the snow outside. His movements were deliberate, calculated, the sound of leather brushing against itself as he circled the cabin. I could feel every muscle in my body coiled, ready to spring, ready to defend. Annie's small form behind the door made the stakes impossible to ignore. I could not fail her. Not this time. Hours dragged on in tense silence, the wind howling like a living creature around the cabin. I considered my options, calculated each potential outcome. If he stormed the door, I would have to act quickly, decisively. If I hesitated, Annie could be harmed, and I would not forgive myself. Memories of Lucy flashed before my eyes, the guilt I carried like a stone in my chest threatening to crush me. I would not let history repeat itself. At last, the wind shifted, carrying his words faintly. You can't hide her forever, Henry. She belongs to me. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my jaw set. Not as long as I draw breath, I whispered, more to myself than to him. The night stretched on, the cold intensifying, the snow piling higher against the cabin walls. I could hear his horse pacing just beyond the threshold, a rhythmic reminder of the looming confrontation. Somewhere deep in the darkness of my mind, I realized that this was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption. Every mistake I had made, every moment of inaction that had cost me so dearly in the past, demanded correction. Annie's safety was not just a promise, it was a reckoning. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight of purpose, a clarity that cut through the fog of grief and guilt. I would not fail again. As dawn began to bleed into the sky, the first weak rays of sunlight glinting off the snow, I heard him move away from the cabin. He had underestimated our resolve, and for now, he had retreated. But the knowledge that he would return lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder that our battle was far from over. I emerged from the barricaded room, carrying Annie into the open, her small hands clutching mine with trust and courage beyond her years. We watched the horizon together, the vast, empty plains stretching into the distance, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it as a unit. We had found something rare, something precious in this desolate land, each other. And that, above all, was worth every risk, every fight, every sleepless night. The winter sun burned weakly in the sky, casting long, cold shadows across the snow, and as I held Annie close, I vowed silently that no one, neither man nor fate, would take her from the home and life we were building together. The morning sun had barely begun to pierce the horizon when the wind carried an ominous warning across the plains. I could feel it in the brittle air, in the crunch of the snow beneath my boots, in the distant whisper of movement that didn't belong to the animals. Annie was already awake, eyes wide as she pressed herself against the small window of the cabin, tracing the horizon with her gaze. I didn't need to ask. She had seen the tracks in the snow overnight, the signs that he had not truly abandoned his pursuit. The world outside was a harsh expanse of white, the snow covering every familiar landmark, turning the homestead into a stark and treacherous landscape. The thought of facing him, knowing the cruelty that had once defined her father, tightened a cold fist around my chest. But this time, I was not the man who had once lost Lucy. I was prepared. I had trained, planned, and watched. Annie's safety was no longer just hope, it was a mission I would not fail. I moved quickly, checking every entry point, reinforcing windows with thick planks scavenged from the barn, and securing the barn animals to prevent any panic that could give our position away. Annie helped where she could, shoveling snow and stacking firewood, her small hands steady but her eyes revealing the fear she could not completely hide. It was a strange paradox. She had grown stronger in the weeks since she arrived, but each day brought a new test of courage and patience, a reminder that the world outside this cabin was unforgiving. By mid-morning, the tracks of a horse appeared again, cutting sharply through the fresh snow. I recognized them immediately, large, deliberate, carrying a menace that only someone accustomed to cruelty could leave. I signaled Annie to stay inside and crept to the front porch, rifle in hand, scanning the open plains. The snowdrifts made it difficult to see far, but the movement of a tall figure through the storm was unmistakable. He had come for her. Patterson's arrival was methodical. He dismounted with deliberate slowness, his boots sinking into the snow, his coat heavy and ice-laden. The air was thick with tension, the kind that grips your chest and makes each heartbeat echo in your ears. I watched him as he approached the cabin, noting the subtle ways he tested the ground, measured the distance, and calculated his approach. This was a man who knew how to intimidate, and I knew I would have to counter every tactic with vigilance and precision. I moved inside, whispering to Annie to remain calm and reminding her that we had prepared for this. My mind raced through every possible scenario, every angle of attack, every weakness in the structure and in our enemy's resolve. Years of isolation and hardship had honed me into someone capable of surviving the harshest conditions, and I intended to use every lesson learned to protect this fragile life beside me. The The first confrontation came swiftly. Patterson's voice rang out, low and mocking, carried through the icy wind. "Henry, you can't hide her forever. She's mine by law, and no frontier rules can change that." My reply was measured, steady, the calm before a storm. "Not as long as I draw breath, Patterson. She's not property. She's a child, and you will not harm her." His response was a sneer, a flash of steel as he drew a knife with unnatural speed. I felt a rush of adrenaline, heart hammering, eyes narrowing. Every survival instinct screamed at me to act, to protect, to fight. The struggle that followed was brutal, a chaotic dance across the snow-slick porch and into the cabin. Patterson was strong and cruel, but I had something he lacked, purpose fueled by love and justice. Every swing, every shove, every maneuver was aimed not at harm for its own sake, but at keeping Annie safe. Inside the cabin, the struggle spilled over tables and chairs, knocking over firewood and scattering tools across the floor. Annie watched from behind the door, trembling but hidden, a silent witness to the lengths a man would go to protect what he had come to cherish. Patterson's knife glinted in the weak sunlight, but I was faster, more determined. With a final surge of strength, I disarmed him, sending the blade skittering across the icy floor and forcing him back into the snow. He rose, coughing and angry, but I held my ground, rifle trained on him as he assessed the hopelessness of his position. "You don't understand," he spat, hatred in every syllable. "She's mine. The law says so." My voice was calm, unwavering, carrying a quiet authority born of certainty. "The law does not define love, nor does it measure protection. You will leave, or you will face the consequences." Patterson hesitated, the realization that he could not intimidate or overpower me settling over him like a heavy cloak. I could see it in his eyes, the first flicker of fear in a man who had long relied on terror to command obedience. With a final curse, he turned and stumbled into the blizzard, disappearing into the white expanse, leaving the cabin and its inhabitants in fragile peace once again. The wind howled around us, but inside, the cabin was warm, a sanctuary amidst the chaos. Annie emerged from her hiding place, small hands gripping mine with a mixture of fear and relief. "He won't come back," I whispered, though even I could not be certain. "But no matter what happens, I will protect you." She nodded, trusting, fragile, and resilient all at once. In the days that followed, we rebuilt, repaired, and reinforced our home. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, yet the warmth inside the cabin grew with every shared meal, every quiet conversation, and every small act of kindness. Annie began to laugh again, her fear gradually giving way to a cautious hope. And I, too, felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a realization that in protecting her, I was also healing myself, confronting the ghosts of my past, and beginning to understand what it truly meant to be a family. The days that followed the confrontation with Patterson were a delicate balance of relief and vigilance. Snow continued to blanket the plains, muffling the world outside, yet within the cabin, the tension never fully lifted. Annie moved more freely now, her laughter timid but genuine, yet every creak of the old floorboards or gust of wind outside reminded us both that danger was never far. I kept my eyes on the horizon, scanning for any signs of Patterson's return. The plains were deceptive, rolling expanses that could hide a man until he was nearly upon you. Each day I checked the tracks in the snow, mapping out potential approaches and escape routes. I reinforced the cabin with extra planks, tightened the locks on every door and window, and ensured that the barn animals were secure and calm. Survival demanded preparation, and I would not fail this time. Annie watched me sometimes, her small hands folded in front of her as she observed every movement. I could see the questions forming in her mind, the curiosity mixed with the fear that had not yet fully dissipated. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked one evening, her voice barely above a whisper as we sat by the fire. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "If he does, we'll be ready. You've seen that I won't let anything happen to you." "Nothing." She nodded, swallowing her fear, though I could feel the lingering tension in her small frame. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in her demeanor, small gestures of trust, a willingness to speak, to ask questions, to engage with the world in ways she had long avoided. It was a slow process, like coaxing a delicate flower from frozen soil, but each day brought growth and hope. The rhythm of our days settled into cautious normalcy. Chores had to be done, meals prepared, the fire kept alive, and the animals tended to, but all these tasks became acts of resilience rather than mere survival. Yet, despite the quiet, the shadow of Patterson lingered. Every noise outside the cabin, every shadow at dusk, every unfamiliar track in the snow carried with it the threat of his return. One morning, as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, I discovered fresh tracks approaching from the east. They were unmistakable, heavy, deliberate, made by a man determined and familiar with the terrain. Patterson had returned. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with resolve. This time, we would be ready. I moved quickly, laying traps and setting up defensive measures around the cabin. Every plank, every nail, every precaution was a declaration of intent. We would not be taken by surprise. Annie helped where she could, stacking firewood, preparing the small stove, and securing the animals in their stalls. Her bravery astonished me. Though young, she had begun to understand the stakes and her own role in our survival. As the day wore on, Patterson's approach became more evident. The snow shifted under the weight of his boots, and the faint sound of a horse's hooves echoed through the quiet plains. I could feel the tension coiling in my muscles, every nerve alert, every thought focused on the protection of the child who had become the center of my world. By midday, Patterson arrived at the edge of the homestead, his figure imposing against the stark white landscape. He dismounted, scanning the area, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the defenses. I remained hidden, observing, waiting for the moment when action would be required. The hours stretched into an agonizing vigil, the wind carrying whispers of threat through the air. Finally, Patterson made his move, testing the outer boundaries, probing for weaknesses. I allowed him to approach, careful to remain unseen, knowing that the element of surprise would be our greatest advantage. When he finally crossed the threshold of the cabin's defensive perimeter, I stepped out, rifle in hand, voice steady and calm. "It ends here, Patterson. You will leave, or you will face consequences." His sneer faltered for the first time. "You think a man like me fears consequences?" he spat, raising his knife in a threatening arc. But I was ready, every precaution planned, every reaction rehearsed in the days leading up to this confrontation. The struggle that followed was brutal, the culmination of weeks of tension, preparation, and fear. Patterson was strong, but desperation lent me a focus that even he could not match. Inside and around the cabin, the battle unfolded, a flurry of movement, struggle, and determination. I blocked his knife, countered his attacks, and maneuvered him toward the reinforced door. Annie watched from the safety of a corner, clutching a blanket to her chest, her eyes wide but her trust unwavering. This was a fight not for survival alone, but for the right to choose our own family, our own destiny, free from the cruelty of a man who had abandoned his responsibilities. After what seemed like hours but was only minutes, I forced Patterson back, disarming him and sending him stumbling into the snow once more. His threats rang hollow against the certainty of our resolve. "I will come back with the law," he shouted, but even as he ran into the blizzard, I could see the uncertainty in his step. This time, he had been bested not by chance, but by determination, by love, and by the unyielding will to protect what mattered most. In the aftermath, Annie and I emerged into the cold light of the snow-covered plains. She pressed close, small hands gripping mine, and I could feel the weight of fear lifting, replaced by a fragile but growing hope. We had survived the storm, both literal and metaphorical, and though the world remained harsh, we had created a space of warmth, trust, and protection within it. The lessons of the past, the memories of loss and failure, no longer bound me. In protecting Annie, I had found redemption, purpose, and the first true understanding of what it meant to choose family. Not by blood, but by love and commitment. And in her eyes, I saw the reflection of resilience, courage, and the possibility of a future that neither of us could have imagined before we met. The days after Patterson's retreat into the blizzard were a strange mixture of relief and lingering tension. Every gust of wind, every shift of snow across the plains reminded me that danger had not been permanently removed, only postponed. Yet in the quiet moments, as the fire crackled and Annie sat close, carefully arranging her small toys and books, I felt something I had not known in years. Peace. A fragile, trembling peace that demanded vigilance, but was peace nonetheless. I often found myself watching Annie, studying the way she moved around the cabin, how she paused at the window to trace patterns in the falling snow, how her small hands trembled slightly when she stacked her little belongings. Each gesture spoke of a child slowly learning to feel safe again, a child discovering that kindness did not always come with threats or pain. And I could not help but think of Lucy, my own daughter lost so many years ago, and the gulf of grief that had opened in my life when I failed to protect her. Night times were the hardest. The silence of the prairie stretched into an almost unbearable void, and the memory of Patterson's threats clawed at the edges of my mind. I found myself pacing, rifle in hand, listening for sounds that might not even exist. Sometimes I would catch Annie staring at me from her small bed, eyes wide in the dim firelight, and I would realize that my vigilance, my fear, my guilt, all spilled over onto her in ways I could not always control. I had to learn balance, had to teach her that fear did not have to dominate every moment. One evening, as snow fell silently outside and the fire burned low, I took Annie to the small porch. She wrapped herself in a thick blanket I had found at the general store and clutched my hand tightly. The wind whipped at our faces, but she did not complain. Instead, she watched the horizon, as if searching for something, or perhaps hoping that the world had grown kinder overnight. "You ever think about your mama?" I asked, softly, letting the words hang between us. Annie nodded, the blanket shaking slightly around her shoulders. "I remember her sometimes. She used to hum when she baked. And she'd tell me stories, like the one about the little girl and the woodsman." Her voice faltered, then steadied. "I think about her every day." I squeezed her hand gently. The memory of Lucy flooded me again, pain twisting in my chest, but now tempered by the recognition that I had another chance. Annie was not Lucy, but in protecting her, in building a home and life together, I could face the ghosts of my past. I could begin to repair the pieces of myself that had shattered when I lost my daughter. The following weeks became a rhythm of cautious normalcy. Chores, meals, lessons, and quiet evenings by the fire. Annie learned quickly, her curiosity insatiable. I found myself telling her stories of the prairie, of the ways of survival, of the animals and the land. She soaked up every word, sometimes asking questions I did not immediately know the answer to. And in those moments, I realized that teaching her, guiding her, was more than a duty, it was healing for both of us. Yet even in these moments of quiet, I remained aware of Patterson. He had retreated, yes, but threats had a way of lingering long after the immediate danger had passed. I reinforced the cabin again, repaired the fences, and kept watch from the windows during the late hours. Every creak of the wood, every shadow cast by the fire, was a reminder that the past had a habit of returning. But this time, I was ready, and Annie had begun to trust that readiness. There were days when she asked me questions about the world beyond our homestead. "Will I ever see other kids?" she asked one afternoon, eyes wide with wonder and hesitation. "Will we go to a town, or meet people?" I hesitated, knowing the harshness of the world outside these snow-covered plains. "One day," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But for now, we must stay safe. The world can be cruel, and I need to make sure you are ready before we go." She seemed to understand, though the disappointment lingered. "I guess I'll wait then. I just want to see the stories you tell come true." And in that moment, I realized that our stories were already coming true. Not the fairy tales she remembered, but stories of survival, of resilience, of trust slowly rebuilt, and of love that grew from the ashes of loss. We were writing our own tale, every day, in small victories and moments of laughter, even against the backdrop of a world that could be unforgiving. Winter deepened, and the snow fell in heavy sheets. The cold outside contrasted with the warmth inside the cabin, a haven we had carved out of isolation and fear. Annie began to participate more actively in chores, learning to feed the animals, stack firewood, and carry water. Her confidence grew, and with it, the bond between us strengthened. I watched her closely, aware of how fragile trust could be, but reassured by the small steps she took daily toward security. One particularly harsh evening, as a storm raged outside, I found Annie curled near the fire, her small form tucked into the blanket. She looked up at me, eyes reflecting the flickering flames, and whispered, "I'm glad you found me." I knelt beside her, chest tightening with emotion. "And I'm glad you're here," I said, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "You've given me a reason to keep going, a reason to try again." In that silence, the world beyond the cabin ceased to exist for a moment. Only the warmth of the fire, the presence of this small, brave girl, and the understanding that we had each other remained. And though the plains outside were harsh and unforgiving, inside, trust and love had begun to flourish where only fear and loss had grown before. The thawing days of late winter brought a deceptive calm. The snow still blanketed the plains, but the sun's faint warmth hinted at the coming of spring. Yet beneath the quiet, I could feel the tension of what was to come, an invisible pressure pressing against the walls of our little homestead. Annie moved about the cabin with a growing sense of confidence, her laughter beginning to echo through the rooms in a way that made the house feel alive again. But even as she played and explored, I remained watchful, eyes scanning the horizon whenever I stepped outside. It was during one of these patrols around the perimeter that I first noticed the tracks. Hoof prints, deep and unmistakable, cutting through the newly melting snow, heading straight for the cabin. My heart froze, and for a moment I thought I had imagined them. But there was no mistaking the pattern, no doubting the message. Someone was coming, and it was Patterson. I returned inside, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Annie, sensing my tension, looked up from her drawing at the kitchen table. "Something wrong?" she asked, her small voice tinged with unease. "Just the wind," I muttered, trying to downplay my alarm. "Go on, finish your drawing." But she wasn't fooled. Children have a way of sensing things adults try to hide. Her eyes lingered on mine, searching, and I realized I owed her the truth, though carefully measured. Days passed, and the unease grew. Patterson had always been unpredictable, but now his presence felt imminent. I reinforced the cabin again, checking locks, barricading windows, and ensuring every tool, every weapon, was within reach. Annie watched, helping when she could, though I kept her distance from anything dangerous. Despite the preparations, I could not shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something inevitable. Then, one gray morning, the warning came. Murphy arrived at the edge of the property, dust clinging to his coat, his face grave. He had been scouting the surrounding roads and towns, gathering information as best he could. "He's coming back," Murphy said bluntly. "And he's not alone this time. Sheriff, bounty hunters, maybe others who'll take his side. You've got to be ready." I nodded, a cold resolve settling in my chest. There was no turning back. This was not just about protecting Annie, it was about facing the shadows of my past, confronting fear, and reclaiming the sense of purpose I had lost with Lucy. The little homestead, once a refuge from grief, had become a battlefield of a different sort, one where courage and love would be tested. Over the following days, Annie and I prepared. I taught her what to do if she ever needed to hide, how to stay silent, how to move quickly without attracting attention. She absorbed everything with remarkable focus, her previous fears slowly replaced by determination. I saw in her eyes the same spark that had once shone in Lucy's, and it fueled a fierce protective instinct within me. The night before the expected confrontation, the wind howled with renewed intensity, rattling the cabin and sending snow swirling in ghostly patterns across the yard. Annie and I sat by the fire, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill of anxiety that gripped me. She rested her head against my shoulder, small and trusting, unaware of the full extent of the storm to come. "I'm scared," she whispered, voice trembling slightly. "I know, little one," I replied, running a hand through her hair. "But we've faced fear before, haven't we? And we're still here. Together, we're stronger than anything that might come." Her eyes closed, trusting, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the warmth of that trust, the weight of her reliance on me, and the promise of protection I had sworn to uphold. Morning broke with a pale sun struggling against thick clouds. The wind had died, leaving an eerie silence in its place. Then, in the distance, the faint sound of hooves, unmistakable and deliberate, echoed across the plains. My stomach tightened, and I signaled to Annie, who understood instinctively. We moved to the hidden spots we had prepared, each of us holding our roles in the defense we had so carefully arranged. The figures emerged from the mist, Patterson at their center, eyes cold and calculating, flanked by two men I did not recognize, rough, cruel-looking men with weapons slung casually across their shoulders. The sight of him, striding across the snow, sent a familiar surge of anger and fear coursing through me. This time, however, I was not alone in spirit. Annie's presence reminded me of the stakes, of why I could not falter. The confrontation was swift and tense. Patterson demanded Annie's return, words sharp as the knife he had once brandished. I responded with quiet firmness, positioning myself between him and the girl I had come to love as my own. The men exchanged tense glances, understanding that this was not a simple negotiation. Every muscle in my body coiled, ready to defend what was mine to protect. Patterson lunged, and I met him head-on, strength and desperation propelling me forward. The struggle was brutal, a clash of wills as much as bodies. Snow churned beneath our feet, the wind carrying the harsh sounds of our confrontation across the plains. Annie, hidden, watched silently, her small heart pounding with a mixture of fear and awe at the courage displayed before her. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of motion and tension. The men accompanying Patterson hesitated, uncertain, their confidence wavering against the ferocity of my resolve. Finally, with a combination of skill, determination, and sheer unwillingness to let history repeat itself, I forced Patterson and his men to retreat, leaving the plains around the homestead echoing with the fading sounds of confrontation. When the danger had passed, I found Annie trembling but unharmed, eyes wide and shining with relief and something more, a newfound understanding of trust, courage, and the bonds that could survive even the harshest trials. I held her close, feeling the warmth of her small body against mine, and in that embrace, I knew that we had not only survived the storm of Patterson's wrath but had emerged stronger, united in a bond forged through adversity and love. The morning after Patterson's retreat was eerily calm. The snow lay thick across the plains, the wind having fallen silent, leaving only the muffled stillness of a world freshly washed in white. I stepped outside, boots sinking into the soft powder, scanning the horizon with the same cautious vigilance that had become a habit over these months. Annie trailed a few steps behind me, her small hand clutching mine with a quiet trust that made my chest ache in ways I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to breathe without the shadow of dread pressing down. The cabin, battered but standing, seemed almost alive in the soft light of dawn. Inside, the remnants of the struggle, scattered hay, overturned furniture, marks in the snow where Patterson's men had faltered, told the story of the chaos that had almost swallowed us. But they also told another story, the story of survival, resilience, and an unbreakable bond forged in adversity. Annie and I spent that day quietly together. I taught her how to repair a broken fence board, letting her hammer and saw with cautious determination. Her laughter, once cautious and shadowed by fear, rang freely through the cold air, each note a small victory against the memories that haunted us both. She moved with the confidence of someone who had faced danger and survived, her eyes bright, reflecting a growing sense of security and belonging. As the day faded into a soft, amber dusk, I found myself sitting by the fire in the cabin, watching Annie carefully fold a blanket she had been sewing from scraps. She looked up at me, a small smile tugging at her lips, and for a moment, the weight of grief that had pressed on my shoulders for years seemed to lift, if only slightly. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think the world was full of bad people. People who would just take what they wanted and leave nothing behind." Her small hands fiddled with the thread, careful and precise. "But now I think there's good too. People who fight to keep others safe. People who choose to love, even when it's hard." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, the lump in my throat stubborn and unyielding. "You're right," I finally said, my voice thick. "There's good. And sometimes, it's up to people like us to make sure it has a chance to survive." She leaned closer, resting her head against my shoulder, and I wrapped an arm around her small frame, feeling the warmth and trust radiating from her. The moment was fragile, yet it was real. A thread of hope spun between two souls who had endured loss, fear, and uncertainty, and had chosen each other despite it all. That night, as the fire dwindled to glowing embers, I thought of Lucy, my little girl lost to flames years ago. The grief still lingered, raw and stubborn, but sitting there with Annie, I realized that while the past could never be erased, the present and future held possibilities. I had been given a second chance, not just to protect, but to love without fear, to repair a heart long broken. And Annie, she had found a home where she could be safe, cherished, and allowed to grow without shadows looming over her every step. In the days that followed, we settled into a rhythm that was simple but profound. I worked the land, repaired the cabin, and tended to the small herd that had survived the winter. Annie explored, played, and learned, her curiosity infectious. She asked questions about everything, the stars, the animals, the old stories of the plains, and I answered as best I could, grateful for the way her presence pulled me back into the world I had long abandoned. Spring came slowly to the Nebraska plains, melting the snow and revealing the green shoots of new life. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, became a home, filled with the sound of laughter, small victories, and quiet moments of shared understanding. Annie and I were cautious, aware that the world still held dangers, yet confident that the bond we had formed could withstand whatever challenges might come. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant streaks of gold and crimson, I sat on the porch, Annie beside me, both of us watching the vast expanse of prairie stretch endlessly into the distance. She leaned against me, small hands entwined with mine, and whispered softly, "Thank you, for choosing me." I felt a lump rise in my throat, emotions too complex for words. I squeezed her hand gently, a promise carried in that silent gesture. "And I choose you, Annie. Every day, I choose you." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of new beginnings. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the vastness of the plains, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Family was not just blood or law. Family was the people who stayed, who loved, who protected, and who chose each other, day after day, no matter the hardships. And so, in the heart of the American frontier, a farmer who had once been broken by grief, and a little girl who had once been broken by cruelty, built a life together. They were not perfect, and the world remained harsh, but within the walls of that small homestead, they had found what so many sought and so few found: trust, safety, and the courage to hope. The plains stretched on, endless and open, but for the first time in years, I did not feel small or lost within them. With Annie by my side, we faced each day not as victims of circumstance, but as architects of our own story. And in that truth lay a power far greater than any gun, any threat, any fear that had once haunted us. The power to choose love, to choose family, and to choose life again. As night fell, stars glimmered overhead, scattered like distant fires across the velvet sky. Annie lay asleep beside me, her small breaths steady and calm, and I sat in the quiet, listening to the wind whisper through the grass. The past was a shadow, but it no longer ruled me. The future was uncertain, but it was ours. And together, we would meet it, hand in hand, heart to heart, unbroken and unafraid. For in the heart of loss, we had found hope. In the face of cruelty, we had found courage. And in each other, we had found family. If you were in Henry's place, would you have fought the same battle to protect Annie? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, and explore the other stories waiting for you on the screen.